everybody, Kim here from CustomDollBaby.com. I've got great news. Today we are doing mottling. It's very exciting because I get a lot of questions about mottling, so it's finally happening. A few things before you get started that we need to know about mottling. The first one is the importance of translucent color. You should always be able to see through your paints. That way we're getting a nice subtle look. We're painting a baby, not a Dalmatian. The number two thing that we need to know about mottling is letting each layer dry. So we're often going to do 3 to 6 mottling layers. It's convenient to do it all in one sitting, but you do want to make sure that the first layer is completely dry before you add on top of it. Otherwise the paint's going to be too movable and things are going to mix together in ways that you don't want them to. And the final thing that we need to know about mottling is to inspect carefully before you cure. Mottling can get too dark, it can get too bright, so we want to make sure that you're happy with the color before it goes in the oven. So once it's been cured on you, you're kind of stuck with it. You can paint over it, but it's much easier if you didn't cure it in the first place. So the last thing I need to mention is that I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that, as you know, we all learn from someone. When I'm doing my online tutorials for free, I can only share information that either I figured out, or it's common knowledge, or it's available for free in general. If there's anything I'm doing that came from a tutorial that another artist is using as a source of income, I'm unable to make that information available for free. So as we're going through this tutorial, you'll see my mottling colors, you'll see how I mix them together, but I can't spell out the precise recipe for you because those don't belong to me. The good news is they belong to Kate Charles, and she's extremely nice, and she's put together a great tutorial that I also use to make my complexion colors for my African American baby dolls. But she has a whole section on mottling where she goes through each step. Each color gives you precise instructions on which colors that you need to blend together and what they're going to look like, as well as show how they look applied to the doll. So fortunately, because of her generosity, this tutorial is available on my website. So be sure to go to the website and check it out. You can get the spiral bound copy like I have, or get the PDF. So it's available, within 24 hours you'll have it ready to go. She's really great. She's also making herself available for questions. So please go to my website, check out the book, and then you'll be all caught up on everything I do when I'm mottling. With that said, let's jump in. For this mottling tutorial, you will need a palette, odorless paint thinner. I keep mine in a squeezy bottle. And 3 Genesis Heat Set paints, Vein Blue, which is one of the pre-mixed colors that you can get in the Bountiful Baby Starter Kit or buy it by itself. Genesis Red, very bright red color. And Ultramarine Blue. It's a very dark blue color. You'll also need protective gloves so that the oils from your hands are not transferred to the doll. You'll need plucked sponges, one for the Vein Blue layer, one for what we're going to call a Dirty Purple layer. You'll need a paintbrush for mixing the paints. You'll need a mop brush for buffing out the paint. And you'll need whatever this is. It's an eyeshadow sponge on a paintbrush handle. So whatever that thing is, I call it like a spongy doo or a spongy bob. These are the 3 tools that you'll need in addition to your sponges and your paints. Alright, so I am preparing my workstation for mottling. What I'm doing is folding up a bunch of napkins so I can have a really thick surface to blot off color. Blotting the color off of your sponge is really important when you're doing modeling because you want it to be as light as possible. So the first modeling layer that I'm going to do is Vein Blue. So for anyone who got the Bountiful Babies starter kit, this is the Vein Blue that I'm going to use for the first modeling layer. As I was saying earlier, you want translucent color, and I want to try to get the whole doll in one swoop. So I'm going to make a lot of it. I just put a lot of paint thinner in the well, so I can hopefully cover the whole doll without having to stop and mix again. And that's a matter of convenience, and it's also a matter of consistency, because I want to make sure I have that same color everywhere I apply the modeling. And this doll has a belly plate, so I have a long distance to go. Now, as you notice, I'm adding very little color, just a teeny bit at a time. Blues are very pigmented, whether it's Vein Blue or Viridian Blue or Phthalo Blue. They're highly pigmented. They get really dark really fast, and it's hard to water them back down when they do that. So I'm very gradually building up the color until I get the concentration that I want. Okay, one thing that I find really handy is using the napkin as a way to check the concentration of color, because you're putting it on a white surface so you can really see what it's going to look like on the doll. I actually wanted a little more concentrated than that. And if for every reason you have to go back and do it again, either because it just wasn't dark enough or you had to strip down a piece and you're remodeling it from scratch, these little swatches on your napkin are so useful for helping you to remember and recreate the color that you had the first time. And you'll see these in Kate's book as well. That's where I got the idea. Alrighty, so I'm pretty happy with this. So you can see through it. It's a nice translucent color. I can still see the bottom of the well. I'm gonna have to keep mixing it up because I do see it sort of accumulating on the bottom. So as I'm loading my sponge, I'm gonna want to stir it off, or stir it up every time. One thing I wanted to point out about my sponges, so I actually pluck a lot. I get all the corners off. I try to create very irregular looking patterns. Some artists will just kind of pull out several big circles in the middle of the sponge, and then in their modeling you can see that circular pattern being repeated all over the doll, which is okay. I mean, I have actually seen real living babies that have that kind of modeling pattern on their skin. Like, it's totally legit. I just don't personally like it, so I try to make my modeling a little more subtle. Okay, so we're gonna apply it to the sponge. I'm gonna use the brush, and I'm trying to make sure that I don't put paint in the parts that I plucked out. I mean, if you get some in there, it's not a big deal, you know, it's fine, but the whole goal of plucking is to have this in regular pattern, so I only want to hit the ones that are raised areas. Test it on the napkin to see how it's gonna look. Oops. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I like to start on the limbs, especially the arms and legs. Well, duh, those are limbs, sorry. Anyway, yeah, the arms and legs, because these are typically more modeled on a baby than, say, the face. So if there's anything wrong with my modeling colors, if they're a little bit darker than I ultimately want them to be, the feet and the arms are a good place to make that discovery. So I'm just going to start right on the bottom of the feet and work my way around. As you'll notice, I am rotating the sponge because I don't want you to see the same repeated pattern all the way down the doll. So I find the slower I do it, the more neatly I can do it.
if I'm trying to do it too fast, I kind of stop paying attention. And next thing I know, I've got a nice repeating pattern on the doll that I didn't want to have. So I try to be aware of what I'm doing. Make sure I'm not leaving any big blank spots. And make sure that I've got a nice irregular pattern. Alright, so that's my blue mottling layer. One thing I forgot to mention that I should have said up front, if you haven't been following along with the series, you need to know that everything I'm mottling already has a base coat layer on it. So this is not the blank vinyl that I'm painting on. This is actually a Flesh 08 base coat that has been applied to the limb and has dried and was allowed to cure. So I've got one full layer of paint on this limb already, and I'm mottling over that. The reason why I like to have the base coat there is that it gives you an even skin texture, so it kind of gives you a better canvas to paint on, and it helps to protect the vinyl. So when you paint any blue on top of the naked vinyl, it's staining. It's very, very staining. If you've ever tried veining a doll that doesn't have any paint on it, like every drop of that veining color gets absorbed into the vinyl. You can't move it, you can't wipe it off, you're stuck with it. So the base coat helps to protect the vinyl from colors that are staining in the event that you have to go back and rework anything or even strip the whole thing down. You have the assurance that the blue stuff's going to come off. So that is very, very important. So please don't model your naked vinyl limb. Take the time to base coat it first. And that way the rest of the painting to follow will go smoother. If you're like me and you're trying to model 10 parts in one sitting, or if you're working with a toddler doll that's really big, if it takes you a long time to get your mottling layers on, it's good to check the concentration as you go. So as you can see, this is getting a little dark because I've been working with it for a while. The solvent is evaporating out of it. So just be aware of the fact that sometimes you'll need to go back and dilute the paints again to maintain that translucent color that you want to work with. So the paintbrush was depositing too much paint for my taste in the creases and those hard to reach spaces. So I'm actually going to switch to this little eyeshadow applicator thing. By it being a sponge, I can actually get a much lighter and more dispersed color. But it's got this little plastic board in it that gives it a bit of a point too, so I can still jam it down in those creases without getting those perfect little circles that my paintbrush was making. Irregular patterns are key for this. And I'm really going to need this a lot for this kit because, as you can see, there are a lot of tight spaces. And we don't want to miss those tight spaces because it's going to look weird. So got to make sure you have the right tools to get into those spots. Okay, so for this limb, in addition to having, all this creasy business that we need to take care of, I've also got separated fingers. So it's very easy to miss the area between the fingers. So vinyl's stretchy and the doll's not alive yet, so what you can do is very gently, and it helps that I'm wearing gloves for this, bend one of those fingers out of the way. I know, it looks so painful. Ah! I'm going to hold it for a minute so that you can model around it. And then, of course, everything I touched, I'm going to have to redo. It's good to do the fingers first, actually. It just occurred to me that was going to be an issue. And I'm going to get between the fingers. I'm going to get base of the fingers, get this little thumb area, lots of creases, lots of deep, deep creases that we need to model around. You don't want to over model your creases, but you want to be sure that you don't miss them repeatedly. You know, if they miss 1 or 2 layers, it's fine, but it's going to look really strange if you miss them every time. So that's where these little sponges come in. Okay, if you feel like you're getting too much in the creases, because paint does like to accumulate there, you can always take your sponge and buff it out. If you feel like, even on one of the flatter surfaces, if it's looking too dark, you can buff it out. Don't worry about messing up your pattern, it's supposed to be random. So I finished modeling all my limbs. What a wild sight this is, right? So those are drying. Now I need to model the face. And I wanted to record that separately because it's kind of a different process. So this is my paint that I have left over from modeling the limbs. It's gotten kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's starting to settle on the bottom of the well. And I've been adding more paint and adding more solvent as I go along to keep a consistent color. What I want to do for the face is dilute it even more. So I already had a translucent color for the limbs, and now I want it even more translucent for the face. The reason for that being, when you look at pictures of babies online, most of them do not have heavily modeled faces. I mean, maybe they have some modeling in the temple or, you know, on the scalp, but I don't really see it in the big fatty areas like the cheeks and the chin and things like that. So I'm going to model it anyway, but I want that color to be even lighter than what I was using before. So this is a nice translucent color for me. I'm going to wring out my sponge so I don't have all the residual paint from what I was doing before. It absorbs a lot of paint as we go. Wowee. Okay, going to keep doing that. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. Okay, so this is a lot more dry than it was before. Gonna keep mixing this up. Okay, I'm gonna apply it to the sponge. And as I said before, I only paint the raised areas. So I want a highly irregular pattern. Gonna blot that just to make sure it's the color I want. So that's looking good. And I'm gonna go ahead and model the head. Now, because I hold this belief that babies are not heavily modeled in the cheeks, I'm actually going to paint it that way. So I'm gonna start with my pattern in the temples. Why does it matter where you start? Well, you have more paint when you first start. So I'm going to do the temples, I'm going to do the back of the neck, I'm going to do the scalp. Sorry, this is really big, so I keep getting in the way of the camera. Okay, so I'm getting the scalp area. Let me push this thing out of the way so I can hold it lower. Okay, so as you can see, maybe, the imprint's getting lighter and lighter. So now that the sponge has kind of run out of paint, I'm going to go back and hit the cheeks. Because as I said, I don't think that's a very highly modeled area. So I'm actually going to wring my sponge out on other parts of the doll so that I have very minimal paint being applied to the areas that I wouldn't really expect to be heavily modeled. And around the eyes too. Okay. And get the top of the head. I just ran out of paint. Where did I stop? Just getting the top of the head. Especially on a bald baby or a blonde baby, I think a modeled scalp looks very nice. So I always try to get plenty of color there, even if I don't really want it on the face. Okay, I'm going to take my little spongy bob and get those creases. Even though I don't want a lot of mottling, I don't want to just blatantly miss spots either. I'm going to get in the ears. And get behind the ears. I like how the ears are relatively flat on this doll. It just feels like it's one less thing I have to paint. Alright. Ooh, 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 ooh. It got too dark. That's too dark. Blot it off before it sticks. Okay. Crisis averted. Some of these spots that I missed. Okay. And put in here. I get around the eyes too. Some people paint under the eyes. They'll do a blue wash, like actually inside the head, to get that kind of faint blue look. I have I'll say I have a low success rate with that. So I just do that in my blue shading, which is lighter. Okay, so I'm just buffing the color out of these creases. And behind the ears. My mop's getting a little beat up. I need to be more gentle. Okay. So we're going to let that dry and see how it came out. Alrighty, so the lake that we started with has now had time to dry. Before adding the next layer, I want to do a careful inspection of the mottling. So I don't know if you can see what I'm seeing, but there's very, very faint blue patternings. Some of the spots are darker than others. There's the spots that we missed. It's actually a little bit darker than I like in these creases because I was using the brush instead of the spongy do thing. So wherever it's too dark, feel free to take a Q-tip and scrub it off. If it's being really stubborn, you might want to moisten that Q-tip with odorless paint thinner to make the paint more movable. But I can just kind of polish off what I don't want. Okay, so aside from that, I'm pretty happy with it. The other thing I'm looking for is blank spots. So something that just wasn't painted at all. And I'm not seeing that. I really like the pattern on the thighs. I don't know if you can see what I see, but it looks cool. So we're ready to move on to the next color. I just realized that I don't use Kate's recipe for my second layer, so I can actually show it to you. I'm going to clean off my palette. I'll just use a dirty sponge if I can find one. I'll use this guy. So the first layer, as you recall, was vein blue. Straight up, good old vein blue that comes in the Bountiful Baby starter kits. I'm going to clean that up out of the palette because it doesn't mix well with other colors. Okay, so now that I've got a nice clean well, I'm going to make a new color. That's going to be a purplish kind of color. So we're going to fill up the well with lots of paint thinner. Because I've got 10 parts to cover. If you don't have 10 parts to cover, don't feel like you have to make so much. I'm going to use my same dirty brush here. And I'm going to take an itty bitty bit. I'll actually start with the ultramarine blue. I'm going to take an itty bitty bit of ultramarine blue. I did get this one from Bountiful Baby. And I'm going to get a translucent blue layer. like I was saying earlier, these paints are very highly pigmented, especially the blues. Genesis Red is actually very pigmented too, so you just have to be careful. You don't want to get too much.
Okay, so we've got that dirty purple color ready to go. I'm just looking over the limb to make sure I'm happy with the mottling, and the blue mottling layer that is. And on this limb it looks a little faint actually. I'm having trouble seeing it, but that's okay because once you've cured it all on, you can always go back and add more. It's easier to add more than it is to take off excess. So if it's looking a little too light, I don't sweat that at all. So I'm going to make sure this sort of dirty purple is all mixed together. I'm going to add it to my sponge. And we're going to apply it to the limbs. This is actually one of my favorite layers to do because it looks so gross and so awesome all at the same time. Like this to me is when it really starts looking like a real baby. And there we go. Like, doesn't that look awesome? I love how this looks. Like, honestly, you could stop right here. If you're a beginner, if you're on a tight budget for time or money, this is great. You can still create a highly professional looking doll without going any further. This just looks so cool and awesome. I'm just filling in the creases here. My little spongy do thing. But it looks phenomenal. And one thing that I'm also noticing is I love how it looks in the creases. And one thing that you will quickly learn about me is my creases color. I make it up as I go along. So whenever I see something in the creases and I'm like, oh yeah, then I'll tend to go with that. I know that sounds very scientific. But yeah, I really do like how it looks in the creases of this doll, and we've got a ton of creases to paint, so we're going to want a color that looks natural there, that gives the level of highlighting that we want without being overkill. Which is why you should never use the Bountiful Baby color called Creases. It's way too dark. Okay, so this is looking cool. We're going to let that dry and go ahead and hit everything else up.